Welcome to DireDen. I'm Brad Wolf, and this is our series on Game Master skills, the Game Master roles. What are the different roles of a Game Master? And today we're talking about game design. And I'm here with Mark Seifter, who was formerly a managing designer at Paizo, who worked on Pathfinder 2 and helped create that game, and is currently the director of design at Roll for Combat, a great third-party publisher. And Mark, welcome.
Thanks. I'm glad to be on the show.
And we brought you on, obviously, for your design expertise. So as we're talking about game design, we could probably spend hours talking about what it's like to be a professional game designer, but that's not what we're here for. We're here for all the rest of us who aren't pros, talking about game design at our tables. How do we customize, homebrew, create new content for our games at our table for our players?
Absolutely. It's an important distinction to make, and it's one that you kind of have to look at the paths that pretty much every designer has taken, and you'll see that anyone who becomes a professional game designer usually does so by at least starting in the same spot where you would be sitting right now. When I joined as a game designer at Paizo, I left my PhD in computer science at MIT to replace a chemical engineering major, Sean K. Reynolds, and join up with an architect, a philosopher, and an art major as the team. So everybody had a different background. But we all shared that we ran games and we designed things for our games. A lot of my experience was in designing things for my own home games, volunteering and running a lot of public games. And I didn't have a huge number of published products, although I think just enough to be able to take the in-house design test. And then I was told that I did very, very well on that. And that's sort of what moved me to the top of the list in that hiring process.
But the point in all that is that as you're running games at your table, speaking to all of you out there, when we're running games at our table, we have a game designer element to us when it comes to what we're creating at the table for our players and for our games and our campaigns. And that's the primary focus today. So, Mark, can you tell us a little more about the differences between the challenges of a pro designer versus the challenges of the home brewer?
Absolutely. So there's sort of this dichotomy in sort of the thoughts about game designers that stretches from two ridiculously different extremes. There's some people who will tell you, oh, the designers, they don't know what they're talking about at all. And the stuff is imbalanced, it's too strong, it's too weak, and I don't know what they're doing. And there are also people on the other side who are like, no, look, the designers know everything. These words are sacrosanct. It was exactly as written in this book. There's no way this could be a typo. There's no way that they would make a mistake. Who are we to try to change or interpret this at all? But in reality, the world is a little bit more nuanced than that, and things are more in the middle. Game designers do know what we're doing, at least I like to think so, and generally have a lot of experience that helps us to make decisions when we're putting out a book for tens of thousands, maybe even more than that if you're Dungeons & Dragons number of players, to try to put out something that will generally work well enough at every average table. But that's very different from what you need to do. You need to put out content that will work at your table. And so therefore, you have an advantage that Mark Seifter doesn't have, that Jeremy Crawford doesn't have, which is you have direct access to all the other players at your table. You can do an unlimited number of playtest passes where you just kind of release something to them, tell them, hey, this is provisional, I might change it, we can make it stronger if it's too weak, we can make it weaker if it's too strong, but I want to let you know that this isn't set in stone, so don't get too attached to it. And then you can get direct feedback from the most invested players and the only players that you have to care about, and it's a small enough number of people that you easily probably have enough time to digest all of their feedback, to take it all into account, and to apply it the next time. It makes home GMs the perfect experimenters, whereas a professional game designer needs to have a strong enough understanding of the theory of game design and the ability to look at the world through the lens of other different kinds of players, like hundreds of different play styles, to try to figure it all out. You don't have to have any of that because you can iterate design and keep tinkering with it until it's just right.
Right, and just right for your table, right? So when we talk about game balance, if you're homebrewing, you are only balancing these things that you're creating against your 4, 5, 6 players, right? You don't have to worry about balancing it across the entire system or for dozens of other tables or hundreds or thousands of other tables.
That's right.
How would you kind of define that fine-tuning process that a home brewer can do And how is that different than the professional designer who has all that other responsibility?
Absolutely. So you know what is going to show up in your campaign, and you can even change it along the way based on how things are going. You know what your group's sort of meta is. And by meta, I'm defining that as sort of the way that they tend to handle situations, even if that's not the only way to handle situations in the game. Does your group have a meta of alpha striking with as much damage as possible, not taking damage if you can avoid it, and then not needing healing, for instance? Or do they have tons of healing and they'll outlast the opponents? Those are kind of metas. And then you also know the players in your group, what they like, what they don't like, and their character. Once you've played a few sessions with a particular character, you know their characters, their builds, and how strong they are. So, to give an example, let's say you have a group where Julie is playing the fighter and Jane is playing the rogue, and Jane's rogue is just outperforming Julie's fighter by a lot. So, and Julie's fighter is just behind everyone. It's just not doing great, and Jane's rogue is doing fantastic. It's not only good at skills like rogues often are, but is doing more damage than the fighter in this group. So you have a lot of options when you're home brewing something. If you decide you want to make a sword for Julie, like a ram blade that you when you slash like a force projection of a ram comes out and deals extra force damage and knocks the enemy away from her, something like that. You can design that specifically knowing that it's going to Julie. You don't need to make sure it's balanced around any fighter getting it or maybe a paladin getting it with some kind of combo or anything like that. And so even if you make something that is just flat out overpowered and it's just better, and that anyone else would say afterwards, oh gosh, if we just take this Ram Blade, it's a 20% increase in our expected damage over the most powerful item that previously existed in the system before. But it's okay if Julie needed a 20% increase to get on par with other people with her fighter. And so not only can you do that, but if you later find out that, well, Julie did something else to bring her fighter back on track, maybe there was an important feat that she grabbed later on that really changed things for her, and now the Ram Blade is putting her above. You can look at either moving back the Ram Blade a little or moving other people up as well, depending on how your group as a whole is doing against the monsters. You have the ability to control the vertical and the horizontal, so you can tweak every last aspect of things in an iterative fashion. And Jeremy Crawford can't come to your house and do that. He has to get it as right as he can when he's working on the book, and I have to as well.
Right. So that's a great point. And like you said, if there's not a paladin in the group, you don't have to worry about what this magic item is going to do in the hands of a paladin. Right. It's only for that fighter and for that campaign. You don't have to keep this item indefinitely for all future campaigns. This is just Julie's sword, right? Likewise, you could bump up, if the rogue now starts to lag behind Julie's fighter, you could give the rogue a magic item or a customized feat or some other thing that bump them back up. And so you can do that fine tuning throughout the course of a campaign. You don't have to have it all tuned at the beginning, right?
Right. Whereas if I release a Ram Blade, and let's say I'm still at Paizo, then people might accept it because it was from Paizo. Whereas if I'm in a third party, they'd be like, third party has made something that was so overpowered, it's always out of balance, and they figured out at first. It might get more accepted if it was from Paizo or from WotC directly. But then later on, if people were like, okay, well, you know what, we accepted it at the time because we're like, well, we think they know what they're doing. But then everyone figured out that the Ram Blade was just 20% more damage than everything else. And the feedback came in, and Paizo or WotC is like, darn it really is. What do we do? So if they decide to errata it, to put it in line, everyone will be very angry. Whereas if you told Julie in advance, I'm going to give you this really powerful sword because I think it would be great for your fighter, it's possible it's too powerful, or maybe it's not powerful enough, we'll change it later. I think Julie is much more likely to understand that than, and understandably so, because it's an experimental option, right? Then when you get something from WotC or Paizo, and you're like, I trusted you though. I trusted that was going to be balanced, and I fell in love with it, trusting that it was stable. And so when it changes, it's like it's harder to accept it when it comes from the like official source than when it comes from your GM. There's a lot of interplay in game design and in making like the rules and house rules for your game that is kind of like your group is kind of like a family, sort of. I know people always make analogies to the family, and where the parents are like the game master and like the book with the designers. And it's my opinion that the book does better when it's trying to be the strict parent and not the fun parent, because you're the one who's actually there with your players, and it's nicer if you can be the fun parent who's always trying to do nice things for your group. Whereas if you have a book that more wants to be the cool parent and then forces you, the GM, to be the strict one, it can be a little bit worse of a time. And I feel like, for example, that 5e as a book sometimes is like the cool parent towards kids when it comes to the way that 5e treats players. And so it can sometimes mean that the GM, when you're coming up with house rules or other changes, have to actually nerf things or tamp things down to get or strengthen the enemies to get things in line with your group, depending on your group's power level, and you might not have to. And then that makes you the stricter one.
That's a great point, and that actually makes a pretty good case for Pathfinder 2 over 5e. I think the but that's I love that analogy that the book, the rule book, is the strict parent, and you as the DM are the fun parent, and that allows you to empower the players, empower yourself, and if you need to fall back on the strict parent, the book, you can, but you don't have to, right? I think that's a great analogy. But beyond that, what are some other things that can empower you as a game designer, or at your table, to be willing to step out and try something new, to add homebrew or to add a new magic item or new feats or that sort of thing?
The only way to get XP and level up as a game designer is to face the challenges and to do something. So if you are the kind of person, I can be like this sometimes too, who is just like, oh gosh, this might be, this is very challenging. Maybe I should just not do it. Maybe I should build up my skills, but you can't build up your skills without trying and failing. And you might be worried that you're going to fail. That's okay. You probably are going to fail. Sorry, you just probably are. If you've done this before and you've never failed, pat yourself on the back, I guess. That's not me. I failed multiple times when I was starting out in high school trying to create content. But the only way to get better is to try. And so there are ways, maybe there's some low CR encounters you can face off against that don't require you to design things right away. Playing some games kind of with standard rules in whatever system you're designing for at first, that's sort of like helps you build up a baseline of understanding of what's normal in this system. Where does the system kind of buckle at the edges, and where does it seem like it's actually very solid and can take more building on it before it falls over? Knowing where the edges and limitations of the system are from playing it a few times first can give you a little bit of a framework. But once you've gotten to that point, you just have to give it a try and let people know you're experimenting. Let people, if you are feeling especially unsure of yourself because this is your first time homebrewing a new content as a game designer GM, tell your players, be like, this is the first thing I've made. I'm making it for you. Generally, for your early content, make content that is designed for your players in mind, especially if it's player facing and not a monster. Pick something that you know they want. In general, it's I believe the first rule of Dungeon Craft from Greg Winnegar, although I sometimes get the numbers mixed up, is not to create something if you don't have to, if it's not something that you need. And so find things that your players are interested in, get them to buy in, and also buy into the fact that it's experimental, and then give it a shot.
Yeah, it doesn't hurt to try, is what I hear you saying.
You'll
And
only get better by trying, even if it was a total failure. In fact, especially when it's a total failure, you learn more from your failures than you do from your successes in general, especially if it's just like, yeah, it was fine. Nobody really cares success.
yeah, I remember early on in 5e, I had a player who was playing a sorcerer, and I was trying to come up with this magic item to help them feel more like kind of a magic gunslinger, right? So I made up this magic item, and I showed it to a couple of my DM friends, and they both said that's way too powerful. It's too game breaking. It's not going to work. But this is at the very beginning of 5e. This is like 2014, and I was like, I'm going to do it anyway. I think it's solid enough. I'm going to give it to this player, and it turned out to not be game breaking at all. Because what we all learned after the first year or so of playing 5e is that the 2014 sorcerer was kind of underpowered. So giving him that boost didn't hurt at all.
Yeah, absolutely. It's very important to know all of the factors of your group. It's something that you have that the professional game designers will never be able to have. And even if somehow they had like a spy camera in your room, they wouldn't care exactly what happened only in your one group. Like I remember talking to you before about how you homebrewed like an ice wizard subclass.
Right. Yeah. I had a player that wanted this ice wizard themed subclass. And so I created it all around, only using ice spells and cold damage spells. Right. And that was probably, other than that magic item, that was one of the first things I homebrewed for 5e.
Yeah. And so there's a lot of limitations that are built into that subclass that will also be limitations that might be much harsher or more lenient depending on other factors of your campaign. So if you have a player, let's say their name is Elsa, and they wanted to play an ice wizard, and in your Icewind Dale campaign, because it's the icy place, it makes sense. But there's going to be a lot of things resistant or immune to cold in your Icewind Dale campaign. There's going to be white dragons, and even at the point where you make an ice wizard, like they could be that they call themselves the ice wizard, but they have some ice spells. But really, they also have some of the big gun spells that are just any wizard is going to want to carry around because they're the most powerful fight-ending spells. But maybe that Elsa isn't going to do that. Maybe that Elsa's only going to bring cold spells. Fill up the entire spell book and all the prepared spells with only cold spells. In that case, in that campaign, you might be able to put in an ability that's wildly overpowered, and it still might be fine because of the other limitations. So For instance, the ability to say, as a bonus action, your ice wizard can cast any of their cold spells they've prepared, and this does not prevent them from casting another spell as a standard action on the same turn, if this is 5e. That would be wildly overpowered in almost any case, because if the person was optimizing, they would carry just enough cold spells to always be able to get off their bonus action, and then they would just use their standard normal action to cast non-cold spells that are like big important ones that are going to debilitate the enemy or buff their allies or something else like that. And so the fact that your player can do this, and maybe it would actually be balanced. Maybe it would be a little above par in some fights, but then when the enemy has cold immunity, then Elsa is very sad. And maybe it works out in that campaign. That's something no professional game designer can expect, because if a professional game designer tried to publish something like that, it would be a very bad idea, because they're not playing only in your one group. But this is an example of just how far you can go by knowing your group and the very specific details of how your group plays.
Right. So you can push the envelope much harder. So you have an advantage over a professional game designer in that respect. Right. You can keep pushing that envelope because it's only for your table and only for your group. And I think one of the real advantages to that, right, is that you can really flex those design muscles. Talking about giving yourself experience points, you can really flex those design muscles when you're pushing the envelope more than you would if you were trying to publish this on DM's Guild or something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think that's very important. It's also the stakes for you, especially if you've set things up in advance and set yourself up for success, are not that risky. It's not a big deal if you have to change it later, whereas the stakes for the professional game designer are pretty risky if they publish something that might look.
Mark is an absolutely brilliant guy. I really enjoy talking to him. So make sure you tune in next week as we continue this series on Monday. In the meantime, click any of the links below, like, subscribe, enjoy more Dire Den. See you next time.